Hello, this is Dorie Clark, and I am here with Kevin Roose. This is our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And today we are talking about how to future-proof yourself in the age of automation. Kevin is a New York Times reporter. He is the author of the new book, Futureproof: 9 Rules for Humans in the Age of Automation. Kevin, it's so great to have you here.
Dory, so good to see you.
It's fantastic. I have known Kevin for a long time,
So long.
actually. Yes, over a decade. In fact, Kevin was one of the stars of my very first book, Reinventing You. So I'm so glad to be back talking with you about your new work around artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I owe it all to you. That without that book, I'd be a barista at a coffee shop somewhere. So
I'm sure that's true. So thank you very much, Kevin. That's amazing. And we also want to greet all of our wonderful viewers tuning in from around the world. Please feel free to type into the comment box to let us know who you are and where you are calling in from. We want to hear your questions too for Kevin about the concept of how do you future proof yourself? What does that mean? So Kevin, I've been enjoying reading your book this week, and the first question that I have for you, one thing that I think is a little bit of a misconception that a lot of people have is that the jobs that many people think are most threatened by artificial intelligence is, oh, it's the cashiers, oh, it's the truck drivers. You actually mention in your book, Futureproof, that white collar jobs may actually be the most vulnerable. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why that is?
absolutely, this is one of the things that surprised me most when I started reporting and researching this book. I thought, like a lot of people, think that automation is mostly a blue collar phenomenon. We think about factories being automated. We think about truck drivers being replaced by self-driving vehicles. We think about retail cashiers being replaced by kiosks, and all of that is happening and has happened. But the biggest gains, the biggest risks for people in jobs right now are actually in white collar workplaces, jobs like yours and mine. There's been some interesting new research out from the Brookings Institution, which they actually took the data from patent applications for AI products, and they cross-referenced that with the wording of job listings to figure out, okay, which jobs are going to be replaced by AI. And they found that actually the majority of them were in white collar industries, sort of high paying jobs that require technical and analytical skills. It's things like sales forecasting and risk adjusting, things in sort of fields like tech and accounting and sales. These are the jobs that are increasingly threatened by automation. And and that's not part of our conversation. We don't think a lot about that when we think about who stands to lose out to automation, but it really does mean that for a lot of us, including myself, like we've had to think very hard about what we can do to future proof our own careers.
Really interesting, Kevin. Thank you for that. I just want to say hi to some of the great folks who are tuning in to join us live. We have Rosinda here from Mexico. We have Mary from Kokomo, Indiana. We have Soledad from Argentina, Cheryl from St. Paul, David from Indianapolis. We have Anna from Vancouver. We are so glad to have you and many more colleagues join us. And feel free to type your questions for New York Times reporter Kevin Roose, author of the book Futureproof, into the chat box. Now, Kevin, another thing that I was interested in early in the book, you actually debunk some of the lines, I guess, that some of the pro AI boosters put forward. I mean, you take a pretty measured stance. You're not saying AI is the panacea. You're also not saying it's the end of the world. But one of the things that a lot of people say who are very, very pro AI is, don't worry about it. In the past, all the technology, all the robots, all the automation has only and inevitably led to more and better jobs for people. You say that's not quite accurate. Can you explain a little bit more?
Absolutely. This is the thing I hear the most is people say, well, look at the Industrial Revolution. There was all this disruption. People had to go, stop working on farms and start working in factories. But in the long run, it worked out. We're all living better lives than our great grandparents were. And so technology is this force for progress. And that is true over the long run. That seems to be true that technology does improve our lives and make our jobs easier and more fulfilling. But it's not always true in the short run, in the periods of time that matter to people. So, in the Industrial Revolution, for example, it took about 50 years after the first factories for workers to actually see their wages rise. Corporate profits were soaring. These companies that relied on industrial manufacturing were making tons and tons of money, but workers weren't actually benefiting. And in fact, they were being exploited. There were, horrible working conditions. Child labor was a big deal. There were labor riots and mass unrest. I mean, it was really a tough time for workers. And so when people say, this is all going to turn out fine in the long run, I think, well, what about people who are worried about the short run? The next 10 or 20 or 50 years, there's going to be a lot of disruption. And so I think people need to take that seriously, because we can't just look at this and say, well, 100 years from now, it'll be okay. So all the struggles that we're having right now don't really matter.
Yeah, 50 years is is perhaps not that long in the history of the universe, but it's quite long in the course of an individual's career. So that's an important note. So thank you for that, Kevin. That's great. We just want to greet some of the great folks who are tuning in as well. We have Navarone joining us from Luxembourg. We have Marion from Atlanta. We have Jeffrey from Connecticut. This is great. We have Al Hassan from Morocco. We have Diane from Cleveland. We're so glad to have all of you here. And please type your questions for Kevin Roose into the chat box. If you're enjoying the conversation about how to future-proof yourself, hit the like button and hit the share button so your friends and colleagues can benefit from this. Now, Kevin, a point that you raised in your book that I thought was especially interesting was you mentioned that when it comes to having your job replaced or not replaced, what you said is, what you do is perhaps not as important as how you do it. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So right now, a lot of the analysis that we have of automation risk, people who may or may not lose their jobs to technology, is based on these broad occupational categories. So there's a site you can actually go to called willrobotstakemyjob.com, and you plug in your job title and it spits out this guess of how likely you are to be replaced by a robot. And I think I got something like 11%, which seems pretty low, frankly, for what I do some days. But I think this is a mistake, because everyone that I spoke to who's an expert in this stuff said that it's not that AI just is going to wipe out entire occupations at once. What it's going to do is to go into occupations and find the most robotic tasks, the tasks that are the easiest for machines to do. And it'll do those better than humans. But there will be parts of every occupation that machines can't do. And so a good example right now is what's happening in medicine. So there are now machine learning algorithms that can diagnose certain types of diseases or cancers on lab scans with much more accuracy than human radiologists. So if you are a doctor and you spend all day in a lab reading scans looking for pathologies, you are at much higher risk than maybe a pediatrician who spends all day working with children and really has good bedside manner and is good at sort of getting people comfortable in a doctor's office. Those are the skills that machines really can't do nearly as well as humans right now. And so those two people, even though they're both doctors, the radiologist and the pediatrician, they don't have the same risk of being replaced by AI. And you can find examples of that in every industry. In my industry, for example, in journalism, there are people who spend all day writing sort of recaps of sports games or local real estate listings, stock market stories. And I used to write some of those myself. Now those can be done mostly by AI. And so what's going to be left are the more human things like what you and I are doing right now that hopefully, cross our fingers, are going to be harder to replace.
Let's definitely hope so. Thank you. I'm here with Kevin Roose. He's the author of Futureproof. And if you want to learn more about Kevin and his book, you can just go to kevinroose.com/futureproof. And if you want to make sure that you never miss one of our weekly Newsweek interviews here that's being live streamed every Thursday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, go to Dorie DorieClark.com. You can sign up for my newsletter list. You can get a free downloaded self-assessment and make sure that you are on the list to find out about these great interviews. So we had a question come in, Kevin, and you perhaps you know more about this than I do. I'm sure, well, obviously you know more about this than I do, but here we go. Jeffrey mentions a particular company. I would Google it, but I want to be present with you. So Jeffrey says, what do you think of the work that companies like Affectiva are doing around creating safer environments? I have to confess, I have no idea what Affectiva is doing, but maybe you've heard of it. If not, we'll get Jeffrey to give us a little bit of information. He says, do you think there are some hidden unknowns with the technology? Do you have a quick take on this, or should we get some more data?
Yeah, I think Affectiva is a company that is making AI software that does sort of emotional analysis. So looking at, images of people and saying, are they, mad? Are they confused? Are sort of sentiment analysis. I don't know how that's being used in sort of commercial environments to create safer workplaces, but there's a really interesting question around what actually we mean when we say human sort of skills. Humans right now are better at certain kinds of things, like emotional intelligence is one that is often talked about. But Affectiva and other sort of emotional AI software is actually doing some of that work. It's better than humans at certain kinds of detecting from people's facial features and from their expressions and body language, like what they're actually feeling at any given time. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. Thank you. And Minx, who is your neighbor in Oakland, also had a question for you, Kevin. She says, who wants to be like a robot anyway? Maybe we will become more expressive of our humanity when robots take over the tedious actions for us. What do you think of that? That would be a pretty positive outcome. Where do you come down on that?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the goal, right? Like AI should be taking our worst, most tedious, most boring tasks and leaving us to, make art and be creative and express ourselves. And this is sort of the best case scenario for this technology. Unfortunately, that's not always how it works. I mean, think about something like an Amazon warehouse. That is a highly automated workplace, tons of robots moving around, bringing shelves to people. But instead of freeing up workers to do more human kinds of expression and work, it's actually kind of turning them into adjunct robots. It's kind of making them sort of collaborators with the robots in a way that actually makes them less able to express themselves, less free. It sort of chains them to these machines, and they're just basically following orders from an algorithm all day. So I agree that this is the best application of this technology, and there are ways that it's improved my job and probably your job too. But it's also not exclusively the case that that's what artificial intelligence does. And so what I'm trying to do is to encourage more businesses and leaders to use AI in a way that improves people's jobs and makes them able to be more human, and not that sort of degrades their humanity and makes them less human.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, Kevin, a comment came in from Navarun who wants to talk about regulation, essentially. He says, it seems like we know where all this is going. It sounds like Navarun thinks it's maybe not a great place. So he says, perhaps some innovations and ideas should be regulated right from the start, like you would with drugs or with nuclear weapons or things like that. What is your take on this? And what is the regulatory environment? It does seem, at least to an outsider, like there's a little bit of a Wild West going on out there. What is the outlook when it comes to automation and AI, and how the government is regulating or not these things?
Well, I think we're on a time delay. So if you think about it, we don't even have really strong regulations around social media yet, which is now, more than 15 years old at this point. So these things take time, but we don't have that much time to regulate AI, because the technology is changing so quickly that if you wait 15 years to write the rules around today's AI technology, it's going to be totally obsolete. So we need a much more nimble regulatory approach to this stuff. And there's been some activity, especially at the state and local levels, around things like facial recognition being used by law enforcement. And that's a very controversial use of facial recognition technology. A lot of privacy activists are very worried about police departments using facial recognition technology. And so there have been some states and cities, including mine, Oakland, California, that have banned the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. So that's a sort of blunt instrument, but I think that we can have more sorts of regulation, maybe not to ban certain types of AI, but maybe just to control their use and make sure that they're open and transparent, and that the companies making them are being responsible.
Really good point. Thank you, Kevin. So Anne jumped in with a question that's probably on a lot of people's minds. She's wondering, would you expect or are you seeing that the value of soft skills like leadership, relationships, or agile thinking is increasing or becoming more premium? And if that's the case, is that actually good news for more seasoned professionals who have perhaps had some time to hone these abilities? What's your take?
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the main takeaways that I came up with in the course of researching this book, is that we are seeing a shift in which skills are valuable. So for the past 20 or 30 years, the skills that have been most valuable in the labor market are kind of what we would call hard skills: engineering, data science, math, those sort of skills that we learn in the STEM fields that we can then apply in the labor market. But now, I mean, those jobs are also being automated, some of them. And so the skills that are newly in demand, that every company needs more of right now, are things like leadership, like courage, like empathy and ability to collaborate and bring teams together around an objective. Those are the skills that really stand out in today's labor market. And so I think those are the skills that we actually need to spend some time developing in ourselves, because I don't know that a lot of seasoned professionals, they might think they have those skills, but how long has it been since you went to an empathy workshop? How long has it been since you did professional development around team building or leadership? We really don't teach those skills anymore, because we assume that they're just sort of innately within us, but you actually have to work on them. And so part of my book is sort of helping people figure out which parts to work on and how, because these are skills that you have to develop just like you would have to take a course on Python or JavaScript. You have to try to be more human. That's not a given.
Such an interesting point. Thank you very much. Again, we're talking with Kevin Roose. You can find out about his new book at kevinroose.com/futureproof. And if you want to make sure that you never miss one of our great weekly Newsweek interviews for our show Better, go to dorieclark.com/LinkedIn. You can subscribe to my LinkedIn newsletter and get regular updates about future guests, including next week's guest, executive coach and podcaster Muriel Wilkins. So, Kevin, one thing that I was curious about, the way that we first got to know each other years ago, we met at a conference, and then I ended up actually featuring you in my very first book, Reinventing You. And the story that I told about you at the time, back when you were in college, even, I feel like in many ways exemplifies some of the principles that you're talking about now. Because specifically, instead of trying to get an internship the normal way, I suppose you could say, oh, let's just send in a resume and hope. You actually had a very unconventional approach and strategy where you reached out and were able to land a pretty unique and prestigious interview, and ultimately an internship with the well-known author A.J. Jacobs. Would you mind actually telling that story and perhaps applying some of those strategies to how you think now about how one can future-proof yourself and be resilient in the job market?
Yeah, so this was the summer after my freshman year of college. I had applied for probably 2 dozen internships at newspapers and magazines and radio stations, and I had been declined for all of them. I didn't get any of them. And so I was kind of on my last legs. I was desperate. I was like, I gotta find something to do for this summer. And I knew I wanted to try writing. And so I found this guy, AJ Jacobs, who I had read some books of his and really admired him as a writer. And I found his email address and I just wrote him an email. And I said, I'm a student. I really like your books. And I would like to work for you. And here are some reasons why. And I think it worked. He wrote back and he said, sure, you can come be my intern for a summer. And that was sort of what started me on my path toward writing books and being a writer. But I think what worked about that was that it wasn't a generic form letter. I wasn't, saying I will optimize your output, and I will make you more efficient, and I will, execute on objectives A, B, and C. It was sort of a weird email. I tried to be funny. I tried to be personable. I tried to really get across to him that I had done my research. I knew what he wrote about. I knew what he might need in an intern, and I really tried to stand out from the hundreds of other emails that he was getting in his inbox every day. And I think that's really an undervalued skill in today's marketplace, is being able to kind of connect with someone over email or other text based media. We see so much sameness in our inbox, whether it's marketing emails that get written by algorithms, or whether it's the little Gmail autocomplete thing that says sure, or looking forward to it, or whatever the little suggested texts are at the bottom of the emails. So much of that is just sort of making us all sound the same. There's a real value in being able to sound different over a medium like email.
Absolutely. I think that's a good lesson for all of us, Kevin. That's great. I'm curious. Jeffrey has a question. He says, my startup's pitch was evaluated by a venture capitalist's AI and was rejected. Do you see a lot more of this where AI is doing the screening rather than humans actually doing it? What's going on out there?
Absolutely. A lot of companies are now using AI to do the first screens of resumes, for example. You'll submit resumes, they'll get 10,000, and the AI will go through and winnow that down to maybe, 200, and then humans will take a look at the rest and sort of filter from there. And actually, there's been some funny stories about people trying to trick these algorithms. Like, they'll put little invisible words in their resumes in white text saying, like, Harvard, or like summa cum laude, or Google, so that the algorithm will actually pick that up. And I think the algorithms have gotten a little bit smarter since then. They've sort of been in this cat and mouse game. But I do think that this sort of evaluation is happening not just in the corporate world, but in things like government. We now have algorithms that are being used to recommend criminal sentences for people convicted of crimes, or determine who is or isn't eligible for food assistance or public housing. So this kind of AI being used to kind of screen candidates for something, whether it's a job or a VC investment, or Section 8 housing. These algorithms are really powerful. We're giving them so much power, and a lot of times we don't even know whether they work. So that's one of the things that really concerns me about AI right now, is that we're sort of using it to do all of these very important things, and it's not even clear why they're making the decisions they're making, what factors they're weighing. We can't inspect these algorithms to see, a lot of the times, what they're doing, and so we just have to kind of take it on faith that they're making the right decisions.
Yeah, it is. It is a little disturbing to contemplate. So, Kevin, Marion was captivated by your story of landing the internship with AJ. He wants to know, how did you leverage that first experience of reaching out authentically for the internship, and have you used that approach afterwards for other connections? I will just jump in to say that you can tell this better than I can, but if I recall your history correctly, Kevin, you were able to leverage that connection in order to ultimately land your first book deal for your first book, which I read and loved, The Unlikely Disciple. Is that correct? And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So yeah, after that email, I went to work with AJ Jacobs for a summer. He took me on his reporting trips with him. I did a bunch of research for him, and that was how I sort of landed on the topic of my first book, which was about a very right-wing evangelical Christian school in Virginia, Liberty University. So that was a direct result of that internship. But I think that strategy has really helped me a lot in my life and in my career. Just, I get so many emails every day now, and I'm sure you do too, Dorie. And it's just so easy to just click, select all, delete all. But the stuff that really breaks through to me is the stuff where it's clear that someone actually has done their research. Someone knows what I do and knows what I write about. It's not being blasted out to 700 people. It's specifically for me. And maybe it's a little bit funny. Maybe it's a little bit, weird. Maybe it's a little sort of, it makes you kind of look twice and say, like, what is this person's deal? That's the kind of thing that catches people's attention now, because everything is so professional, so slick, so indistinguishable from one another. And I think that being a little offbeat has really helped me. And I don't know, do you use that too?
Absolutely. I think all of us these days are getting so many pitches and form letters that seeing something that's a little bit different is really valuable in terms of just catching your eye and being distinctive. We think that we need to sound more corporate to be more professional, but actually, in many ways, the opposite is true. That the more human, the more regular and normal you sound, the more distinctive, and therefore probably the more likely one is to take action and respond to it as a result. So I think that's a great point. And to that end, Kevin, one of the things that really struck me in your book, Futureproof, is you mentioned that you have personally adopted a ritual that you use, kind of a, we can maybe call it a daily detox called Human Hour. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, human hour is one of my favorite things that I did when I was writing this book. I started um, sort of worrying that I was getting less human. In addition to robots getting more human, I started worrying that maybe I was losing some of these skills. These sort of deeply human skills. I was sort of becoming more homogenous as a result of staring at my phone all day, looking at social media all day. And so I implemented this hour every day. It's usually from around 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, sort of that before dinner hour, when I put down my screens, I put down my phone, I go do something physically in the world, whether it's, weeding in the garden or taking the dog for a walk or, doing some exercise. It's just an hour where I am working on being a human in the way that you would work on, building better endurance through marathon running or something. I'm just training myself to remind myself that I am not Kevin the internet persona. I am me. I am a human. And that really has helped me, not just sort of with you know happiness and mental health, but also I think with helping me build some of these abilities that I think will help me in the coming years in my career.
I love that. And so does Alita. She says, yep, we can't quite automate our own authenticity, even when we're building excellent habits. Making space for spontaneity and curiosity is still important. Absolutely. And Kevin, one thing I would be remiss not to mention is that many people perhaps first became aware of you a couple of years ago with your viral article that you wrote for the New York Times about your 30-day phone detox. You went on the Today Show to talk about this. This was apparently a bit of a media sensation. Can you talk about what was going on there? It sounds like you really believe you were sort of addicted to your phone in some way. What did the process of detoxing from it look like, and how has that changed how you relate to it now, all this time after the official detox?
Well, this all sounds a little quaint now because this was before the pandemic, when I think all of our screen time probably doubled or tripled because there was nothing else to do. But this was back a couple years ago, and I was spending something like 6 hours a day on my phone, which at the time, again, pre pandemic, felt like a lot, and felt like it was getting in the way of not just my relationships and my work, but it was really getting in the way of my humanity. It was making me, meaner and less thoughtful. It was sort of taking me away from social interactions. It was really getting inside my head to a degree that made me very uncomfortable. So I had sort of a breaking point where I realized I needed to do something about this. And so I called this woman, Catherine Price, who is a phone coach who actually helps people detox from their phones. And for 30 days, she helped me with my phone. She helped me detox. And by detox, I don't mean get rid of my phone. Like, that's not the goal, because I don't think unless you're a farmer or you live in the mountains or something, like, you can't do that today. So the goal is just to restore your sort of rightful relationship to your phone. When we first all got cell phones, they were amazing tools. They were like our assistants. We could look things up, we could have them, do things for us, we could send emails. And now they're more like our bosses. They tell us, like, you have to pay attention to this now and do this thing now. And they're constantly taking us out of the world that we're in and getting us onto their schedule. And so this 30-day detox really helped me kind of demote my phone from being my boss back to being my assistant. And that was a huge important thing that I probably am going to end up needing to do a bunch of times, because it's easy to slip into old habits, and these phones are getting more and more addictive. And so I probably need to do that again.
I think in many ways we probably all do. Thank you so much, Kevin Roose. Kevin is the author of the new book, Futureproof. You can learn more about it at his website, kevinroose.com/futureproof. And if you want to make sure that you are tuning in every week to our Better series, go to dorieclark.com, sign up for the email list, and you will receive updates. Kevin, it has been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in with the great questions. And Kevin, any closing thoughts or advice for folks as we part ways and attempt to be human out in the world?
No, good luck. I mean, it's a challenge every day, but we can do it. This technology does not have to dehumanize us; it can make us more human. And Dorie, I'm so grateful for your time and your thoughtful questions, and it's been a real treat.
Thank you so much, Kevin Roose, author of Futureproof. We'll see you all next week.